Hi, my name is Dara Gleeson. I'm a project consultant with IES. The talk I'll be giving today will be about how we can make use of sort of operational data from buildings and design stage energy models, combining these two ideas to make savings and improve operations in buildings. I'll begin by talking a little bit about what I mean by energy models, what do I mean by modeling. I'll introduce a concept known as the performance gap, if it's something you're not familiar with. I'll talk a bit about data analysis, particularly the types of data that we might want to look at in a building and the reasons for actually analyzing it. And then I'll introduce a concept of an operational model, whereby we take these design stage models and make them enrich them with data from the data analysis to make them a closer match to your real building. And I'll finish up then with a case study where I show how we've demonstrated these concepts on a project within the last year. So we'll start by giving a little bit of background to who IES is, if you're not familiar with us. We're a UK-based company, primarily a software company. We're headquartered in Glasgow, but we have a global presence. As well as producing software, we also provide consultancy services, and we have a large research and development department. Our core product that we're best known for is called the virtual environment. It's widely used by architects and engineers around the world in the design of new buildings to try and make them more efficient, and also to improve things like daylighting, ventilation, and for things like predicting energy consumption in buildings. We're also widely used in the UK for demonstrating compliance with building regulations. So in England and Wales, to demonstrate compliance with Part L, you can use our software, or in Scotland to demonstrate compliance with Section 6. However, there's a concept known as the performance gap, and effectively the performance gap is the difference between design stage predictions of energy use of buildings and what actually happens when the clients start getting the bills. Now, there's many reasons for the performance gap. One reason was that often designers were using compliance models, so models built to demonstrate compliance with building regulations to predict future energy consumption. However, the software framework for demonstrating compliance with building regulations was fundamentally unsuitable for predicting how a building is going to perform in use. So effectively, the wrong types of models were being used to predict energy consumption. As well as that, the performance gap was caused by other issues related to the construction industry, so discrepancies between design documentation and what was actually installed and built, new and innovative systems being poorly understood by designers and installers, poor commissioning or a lack of commissioning, so insufficient budget being allowed for commissioning of the building systems, or insufficient time being allowed when project timescales were squeezed. And finally, there was often a lack of feedback from construction to the designers so that they can learn from mistakes. So maybe a lack of looking at the data from a building in performance and using that to refine the next designs. So we'll move on now and talk a little bit about data in buildings. So when I say data, what I'm really talking about is things like half-hourly gas and electricity data, sub-meter data, data from smart meter systems, modern lighting systems, and crucially, building management systems, which control the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning in modern commercial buildings. That there's a whole host of operational data that can be tapped and recorded from these systems that often isn't. And you can start to utilize this data to really understand how a building performs in terms of energy use. With only things like monthly bills, you get maybe a very poor picture of what's going on inside a building. But as you start to leverage things like sub-metering, with maybe regular reads, you start to understand things a bit clearer. But by utilizing smart metering, high interval data, BMS data, the picture becomes a lot clearer. And finally, with modern kind of data analysis techniques, you start to get a very clear picture of what's going on inside a building in terms of times of use of particular pieces of equipment. Perhaps is there areas that are uncomfortable, areas with insufficient ventilation, or high energy use outside of occupied periods. So these are the sort of things that you can start to catch when you do data analysis and collect this building data. To this end, we've developed our own tool called IES Scan. It's a analysis software for looking at the sort of high resolution data that we get from modern buildings. It's a web-based tool. You can collect your data from multiple different sources, so from your BMS system, from your submetering system, and collect it all on a single portal that you can access from anywhere because it's web-based, and try to find opportunities to reduce energy consumption and improve comfort and performance. Crucially though, the scan software links to our core simulation software that's used at the design stage by architects and engineers, and that's something I'll come back to in a little bit. But even by itself, data analysis is worthwhile in sort of modern commercial buildings. Often you can find very quick wins of savings to be made that arise from the sort of commissioning and controls issues that arise from the sort of performance gap I touched on earlier. So when time to do commissioning is squeezed or commissioning budgets are squeezed, often systems in new buildings aren't performing as they were intended by the designer. By looking at this data with modern analytical tools, you can quickly find savings that can be made just by small tweaks, changing set points, run hours, and also you might find bigger opportunities for savings through capital investment. A project we've completed recently on the Riverside Museum in Glasgow was just this week shortlisted for the CIBSE Building Performance Awards. In that project, over a 12-month period, we achieved around £60,000 worth of savings just by simple interventions to things like run hours on ventilation units, ventilation rates, and just small adjustments on when pumps ran. The project paid for itself in under 6 months. And that takes me on now to the idea of an operational model. So I've mentioned a few times how our software is used by architects and engineers at the design stage for predictions of how a building will perform while built. Now we know from the performance gap that sometimes there's a big difference between what was predicted and what actually happened. We can start taking the data from the building that was built and use that to refine the model so that you then come out with a model that's a very close match to the real building. To that end, we've developed some tools, primarily for designers, to design much quicker, so allow them to iterate models to come up with more efficient solutions quicker, but you can harness those same tools to iterate the process of calibrating a design stage model to make it a close match to the real building. So tools like optimization and parametric analysis are very valuable there to drive down the cost of a calibration exercise. So why would you want an operational model? Why do you need a model that's a close match to your real building? Well, it enables you to perform sort of what-if scenarios. What if I lowered my heating set point? What if I ran my AHU for 3 hours less per day? What if I turned off my chiller to avoid kind of peak demand tariffs? What impact will that have on energy, cost, and comfort? So you can perform all these types of analysis with a model without using your real building as the guinea pig. You can also evaluate maybe retrofit measures. So if you're considering an expensive retrofit, you could evaluate that on the model to see whether it's worthwhile, and also use that calibrated model in a measurement and verification exercise after the installation of the retrofit to see has it achieved what was claimed. And finally, the calibrated model can be used for kind of ongoing commissioning. If you have a model that's a close match to how your building performs in terms of energy, if you continually run the model and compare it to your real building, if they start to drift from each other, you can spot maybe changes in the real building that were suboptimal. The energy use drifts upwards in the real building, but not in the model. You can be sure that there's a fault there that needs to be found. So that takes me on now to the case study where we applied some of this technology on a project for a client. The client was Bart's NHS here in London. And the building we looked at was the Alex Wing, which is a dental teaching hospital on the site of the Royal London. The project scope involved looking at the sort of building data they had. So that included BMS data. They also had an extensive submetering strategy at the site. So not only did they have a lot of submeters, they were well thought out in terms of where they were allocated, which made it quite easy to identify floor by floor what energy was being used on. So this made it very easy to create a calibrated model that was a close match to the real building. We could then, once we had this calibrated model, use it to identify opportunities to save energy and also to a high degree of accuracy, find out how much those savings might be. The process involved, unfortunately, the design stage models weren't available to us, so we had to build a model ourselves from scratch based off the design stage documentation. We then started to leverage the data that was coming from the building system. So using the scan portal, connecting to the model, we took in things like the BMS data to refine schedules in the model to make it a closer match to the building. We could then look at the sub-meter data and use that to ensure that the energy using equipment in the model matched what was using energy in the building. And finally, we can use real weather data to ensure that any simulations we conduct on our model is based off the same weather that's the real building is experiencing. And through a process of iteration, you could ensure that the model matches very closely. I've got a chart there of electricity for a week in November 2015. There's a blue line and a green line for simulated and real. And as you see, they're a very close match to each other. It's important to note, though, that it wasn't just a case of eyeballing charts to say that's a close match. There's sort of industry standard guidance on how to calibrate the model and when it's calibrated. So ASHRAE Guideline 14 is a document which provides specific statistical measures you can use to say, yes, my model is a very close match of the actual building. So we comfortably met the targets for calibration from ASHRAE Guideline 14. And once we had this calibrated model, it was time to actually start making use of it. So one of the things we used it for was to verify what savings had been made by the FM team at BARTS. So the FM team at BARTS were making interventions on their own to try and improve operation at the building. And we were able to, by comparing simulated data against the real building, try and see how much has been saved by these interventions. So changes made to DHW, secondary circulation, and run hours and ventilation units, we could see that over a typical year saved around 29% of gas energy and around 6% in electricity for the whole for the building. As well, we could look at building performance data, so performing analysis using the SCAN tool. We could try and identify further savings and try and cost what they might save. So we looked at things like, when are the people in the building? So by looking at things like sub-meter data for the lifts, you could actually understand when the building was at peak occupancy. And then by looking at the air handling units and seeing when are they ventilating, you could maybe find that there's areas where ventilation rate can be reduced when there's hardly anyone in the building, and also periods when plant can be shut down because the building is closed. So just by performing data analysis, there was a number of quick win savings that could be found. As well as that, we used the model to look at the potential for kind of bigger interventions, so more expensive capital investment, like the installation of photovoltaics and CHP. And it was possible to see sort of in isolation or combined what the possible savings of these interventions might be. So I'll close off with sort of final thoughts that hopefully you can see the value that can be derived from just looking at building data using kind of modern analytical methods. For a long time, this data was not being harnessed, but there's huge savings which can be made just by taking modern tools to look at this data and find inefficiencies. But as well, simulation models that are produced as a matter of course for all new buildings in order to meet regulatory compliance, those same simulation models can become a valuable digital asset to facility management teams for sort of ongoing commissioning and ongoing operation of the buildings. And it's this next step of turning your design stage model into an operational model, which I think provides massive value going forward.